All right, hello again. Really just going to spend a few minutes here talking about the second law for this week, which is the Equal Pay Act of 1963. So like Title IX, this is also a statutory law or federal law that was passed by the legislative bodies at the federal level. In this case, it was passed in 1963 by Congress and then signed by Kennedy. Basically, at its core, the Equal Pay Act states that it is illegal for employers to pay female employees less than their male counterparts. And in terms of application, this applies to all companies in the US. Keep in mind that much like Title IX, prior to this law being put in place, it was deemed perfectly acceptable for employers to purposefully pay women less money for doing the same work as their male counterparts. I know it seems crazy to say that, but that's what was happening. Some of the reasons that were given at the time were, well, young women who are working, they're just going to quit anyway once they get married and have kids, so why would we invest in them now? Other rationale given for paying women less at the time was, well, women have husbands that work, so we don't have to pay them as much because their salary isn't the one that's going to be paying the bills. Obviously, very outdated in terms of thinking, sexist, all of those things, and thus the need for this law. So the bills passed in 1963. You can see at the time, women made just 59 cents for every dollar men made. We'll look at the progress here on the next slide. But keep in mind the massive disparity there in terms of what women were making for doing the same work. The bill itself states the following: employers must pay male and female employees equally if they are doing equal work on jobs that require equal skill, effort, and responsibility, and also have similar working conditions. So I just want to break down a couple of those pieces from the bill itself, just so that you know what we're referencing. So when they refer to skill, they're talking about the ability to do something well, right? The level of expertise a job requires, right? So if a park district is hiring a financial manager, they might want to hire someone who has the skill to use Excel to create and update budgets, right? So that would be an example of skill. Effort, referring to the amount of work or energy that is required to complete a job. Responsibility, basically just referring to the state or fact of being accountable for something. Of course, you can look at a job description to see what types of responsibility a job would require. And then finally, working conditions, we're referring to the amount of time required, the physical, mental demands of a particular position. So assuming all of those things are equal, under the Equal Pay Act of 1963, both men and women should be paid the same amount for doing those jobs. Now, keep in mind when we refer to pay in the context of the Equal Pay Act, we're not just referring to salary, although that's probably the issue that's most prominent in these legal cases, but we're also talking about additional pay like bonuses. We're also talking about other benefits like being paid for sick time or a holiday or vacation pay. Any kind of compensation would be included under the Equal Pay Act of 1963. Okay, well, is it working? Well, we know that it has made a lot of progress in this country, right? We knew that in 1963, prior to this bill, women are making just 59 cents for every dollar men are making. Now it's estimated to be anywhere between 79 to 81%, depending on which study you look at. So have we made progress? Absolutely, right? Much better than what it was in 1963. Keep in mind that we still got a gap here, right? So for every dollar that men make, women are still making less. And if you dig in even deeper and you look at female minorities, that number is, the gap is even wider. So it's still very concerning that we have this gap. I do have some census data here on our field. So if we look specifically at fitness and recreation employees, you can see that women are paid 72.8% of what men are paid. So even lower for employees in our field that are women in terms of the gap. So obviously this is concerning for us in our field. We want to see that gap close. We want to see women paid equitably based on their skills and abilities. So you might be wondering, well, what can we do as practitioners to close this gap or work to close this gap? And there are certain things we can do, especially once we get into management roles, to try to minimize this gap. One is, providing negotiation training for female employees. A lot of the issues with this pay gap are that women generally do not start out at a base pay that is comparable to their male counterparts, and thus over time it's hard to make up for that. So providing some level of negotiation training early on for practitioners could be helpful, could assist women in getting a higher base pay that's comparable to their male counterparts. Transparency is another way that we can work to close this gap. We'll look on the next few slides here at some of the other legal actions that have come forward to try to close this gap. And one happened under the Obama administration, where he essentially signed an executive order that would require companies to release their pay information. Basically just called them out and said, if you're not complying with the Equal Pay Act, we want to see it. Obviously, you can imagine there's some pushback by those major companies not wanting to do that. The current administration has rescinded this order, but there is another law that's working to try to provide this transparency. As you can imagine, if companies are forced to reveal their pay information, they're probably going to be more likely to follow the law, right? Especially if it's going to show that they're not paying their female employees comparably to their male employees. So transparency is a huge piece, and we can do that as practitioners in the workplace. Even though it may seem taboo to share your salary information with your peers, it can actually be a really empowering way to learn about pay inequities in the workplace and fight for what is likely owed to you based on a disparity. Keep in mind, a lot of you will be entry-level employees here in the field of recreation and sport in the coming years, so you may not be in a position to hire for a while. But keep in mind that eventually you'll probably all be in a position to negotiate salary at some point. Make sure that you're doing your part to provide a fair and equitable process when you're making salary offers. Make sure that you keep the Equal Pay Act in mind when you are doing that. Once we get to our unit here on contract law, we will talk a little bit about negotiation. So we'll work on some of those skill sets. It's not something that generally we learn about in school, but it's an incredibly important skill set, particularly for women to learn about, to try to make up for this pay gap that exists. Okay, so one thing that I do want to mention is that there are some situations where it is justifiable for a sport or recreation organization to pay a male more than a female. It's very rare, but in cases where we're talking about coaching, which is obviously pretty common in college athletics and high school athletics, the courts have said historically that it is okay to pay the male coach more than the female coach, assuming one of these legal justifications for discrepancy in pay is met. So you probably read about the Stanley versus USC case from the reading this week. We learned in that case that the female basketball coach was filing a lawsuit against the school because she found out she was making far less than the male coach. If we look at their jobs on paper, we would think they're doing the same job. They're both coaching the sport of basketball. Under the Equal Pay Act, why is it legal for them to pay him more than her? Essentially what USC was able to argue was that there were some specific differences in the job that the male coach was doing and his ability to garner more revenue in the marketplace than she could. So we'll look at some of these legal justifications here below, but just note that that Stanley case is precedent setting in the ability for schools to pay their male coaches more than their female coaches. But again, keep in mind, this only is allowed if the school can show one of these legal justifications for discrepancy. So one, education. If you can show that one person has more education than the other, maybe one has a master's degree and the other doesn't, then they can pay that person with a master's degree more, right? Again, these justifications can apply to any equal pay case, but I use them in the context of the coaching example because I think it's relevant to our field. Experience. Let's say one person has more experience than the other in terms of how many years they've been coaching. So in the case of Stanley versus USC, the male coach had several more years coaching experience than the female coach, and thus they're able to pay him more because of that experience. Marketplace value. Okay, here, if a coach has the ability to go elsewhere and obtain higher pay, basically they have more value in the job market. This is a pretty common justification used for paying male coach more than female coach in college and high school sports. So in the case of Stanley, they argue the male coach can garner more pay in the marketplace if he were to seek other jobs in the conference or in the country, and therefore, because of that higher marketplace value, they could pay him more in order to keep him. Finally, another legal justification for paying a male more than a female is if you have some kind of merit or incentive-based pay. So basically, as a coach, if you negotiate some kind of incentive-based pay into your contract, so for example, the male coach negotiates in their contract a $10,000 bonus if the team makes the NCAA tournament in March. That's an example of incentive-based pay, right? Merit-based pay could be applied in any field or any workplace in our field. So if you sell X amount of fitness memberships, you get an additional $1,000 in pay. That's a merit-based pay system. Again, it would not be illegal to pay the male employee more if they receive that money because of a merit or incentive-based pay structure. Okay, so those are the legal justifications for discrepancy in pay. Again, I use the example of coaching because that one's pretty commonly applied in our field, but keep in mind those justifications can be used outside of a coaching world as well. Okay, one last slide here and then we'll wrap it up for this unit. There have been some other equal pay initiatives out there in recent years. The Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act of 2009 was a pretty big law when it was signed into law by Obama in 2009. Basically, this law addressed the fact that there were these really time-intensive statute of limitations on women's ability to file equal pay lawsuit. And so the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act extended those to the most recent paycheck. So basically it gave women more time to file a lawsuit under the Equal Pay Act if they found out they were being paid unfairly. And then one other thing that happened in 2016 was that the EEOC, like I mentioned on an earlier slide, created this action through Obama's executive power that said we're going to collect pay data information from a number of employers. Basically, any employer who employed more than 100 people, they wanted the pay data on those companies. Again, this in theory was about transparency, right? It would reveal the companies that weren't providing fair pay to their female employees. Like I mentioned before, the current administration has rescinded this particular policy, so it's no longer in action. But with that said, there is a current bill that's on the Senate docket right now, Paycheck Fairness Act, which addresses some of that transparency stuff. It also basically goes a few steps further to update the Equal Pay Act. It makes it illegal for employers to retaliate against an employee for seeking pay information or providing or sharing pay information with other employees. So this Paycheck Fairness Act is just recently passed the House in Congress. Like I said, it's sitting at the Senate's door just waiting. It's hard to tell whether or not this current Senate will even consider it. The upcoming election could play a big role in whether or not that bill gets passed. Again, it will continue to change the way that we look at pay inequities in this country if it's passed. So definitely keep an eye out on that bill.